Every technological change, you see changes in roles, and that's not unusual. All I hear all day long is that AI is going to take my job. Yeah, I think all jobs eventually are going to graduate to something new, and that should be a good thing.
Welcome to It's About Data. In episode 87, we discuss AI's impact on jobs and education. This is a continuation of our conversation with Stephen Messer from episode 86. So, Stephen Messer, welcome back for another episode. We're actually recording back to back here, but we want to jump into some new topics, which we didn't have time for in the last episode. And basically, you were saying that in spite of the claims from a lot of CEOs, from a lot of business analysts, politicians, that AI might put people out of work, you have trouble finding people with skill sets that are useful in an AI first business like Collective Eye. So, why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, look, I think every technological change, you see changes in roles, and that's not unusual. So if anyone's listening and thinking, all I hear all day long is that AI is going to take my job, yeah, I think all jobs eventually are going to graduate to something new, and that should be a good thing. Usually, when new jobs come out, they pay better, they are more fulfilling. I can't think of a year or a 10-year decade where I'd want to go back and have that job, right? Things have only gotten better for us. But it does mean you have to change your skill set. And I think where AI is a bit different is it's not about becoming an expert in a particular topic or an expert in a narrow field. That has been probably the last 100 years of specialization that have really dominated the way companies and organizations generally operate. This is a bit different. I would argue that what makes AI sometimes challenging for people to transition to is that it's a very first principles approach to the world. Whereas if you think about most jobs, it's been about getting more and more experience doing the same thing, right? If you think about college, you had this broad experience.
Yeah.
Then you went into your work and you got a very narrow experience. And I used to teach at a business school at Columbia. And I remember sitting with the dean one time. This is maybe an interesting story, but he basically said one of the reasons why people come back and go to business school is because they graduated college and said, you know what, I want to be an aeronautical engineer. So they went to Boeing because they thought they were going to build planes. And after 2 years, they figured out that all they were doing was a CAD model of one bolt for 2 years,
Mm,
and they hated it. But the
yeah.
problem is, every time they went to interview for another job, people were like, "Why are you coming into finance? You did CAD for a bolt for an airplane. That's what you're good at. Go do that. We want a guy who spent 2 years in finance." And so they would go to business school as a way to get 2 years to reset their career because they
Mhm.
were so narrowly focused.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's fair.
That's not AI.
Yeah.
Yeah.
AI is the narrow focus. It knows all that. What it doesn't have is the skill of breaking down things to its core, to its root, and then saying, with this new kind of technology, with all these different AI models, I've got language models, I've got economic models, I've got robotic models. What is the world going to look like? And I think for the next 2 decades, that is the kind of thinking you need. So when I try to hire someone, I don't want someone who says, I've had 20 years selling a product. What I'm trying to figure out is someone who comes in and says, how will someone buy this product? And
Mhm.
what can the AI do to make their life better? And how can I extend the AI into their business?
Yeah. What you're really talking about here is, I think, it's becoming very intent driven, and then basically sort of then deconstructing back from that. Basically, what are the questions I should be asking? What this is reminding me of, this is such a coincidence because, as I said, I was at SAP Sapphire last week. I don't want to digress, but this is just sounding just parallels are just too crazy. And traditionally, with enterprise software, again, we're not talking about the SaaS apocalypse, but traditionally, in a sense, you're basically you had up a screen and you had to choose the actions to do to get
Hmm.
whatever goal you wanted. And what SAP is saying, and this harks back to our last conversation about agents, is that you're going to go up there, in the system, in the screen, and instead you're going to just type out, or maybe you might use spoken voice, spoken word, but you're going to tell out like, this is what I want to do. How do I get there? It sounds like sounds very much aligned to what you were just talking about.
Yeah, and in fact, I would give the example of Amazon is a good example for a lot of reasons. But one of the things that they did was they became great at whatever it is they were trying to do. So
Yeah.
let's say they wanted to do overnight shipping, Prime, that's a good example. They became so good at it that they then became the master of extending that to their customers.
Right.
Today, you can actually now use Amazon as your logistic hub. In theory, your competitor became your marketplace where you were able to
Yeah.
sell to your competitor. And now they're even saying, I'll do the shipping for you in a way that's as good as Prime. And I'm going to compete with FedEx and UPS. And I think this is where the world, when I said we're trying to find these kinds of thinkers, you're right. We're trying to figure out how do we become the best at this AI first thinking where we're trying to remove as many steps that a person would have done and just switch it back in.
You mentioned how Amazon became such an expert in its own logistics that it's farming out its logistics services. I seem to recall they did the same thing with compute.
Yeah. And massive business was built and their
Yeah,
customers were grateful for it, right? They
exactly.
became experts at virtualization. Virtualization opened up a new line of business
Right.
that a bookseller in theory shouldn't have done, but what it was they became experts at that time in really deployment. And I think this is what I think we see over the next, decade to 2
Right.
decades is how do you become the new expert in this new world? And you're not bringing the legacy of the past into trying to operate a little bit better, which is, I think, a lot of why when you hear analysts talking about what the SaaS companies will do, I think what they're worried about is that they're all trying to do chat GPT wrapped around their old
Mm,
product
Got it.
because that's a loser.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. If you
I think
can't
that's what they're
rethink,
worried about.
Lipstick on a
yeah.
pig.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to take the conversation in a slightly different direction that you kind of teed up here, which is you talked about how college is about generalization, even if you pick a very specific major like physics, which is what I majored in. It's very general, right? You have general education and you study a lot of different types of physics. And then B school, kind of the same thing, right? You go get an MBA, very general. What do you think education should look like now and in the future so that we have more of this type of person that can have a larger vision about where business needs to go and how to deploy AI in new ways, as opposed to being an expert in one bolt, which is what businesses have been training people to do for decades?
Look, I think the thing about all these regressive technologies are they're essentially modeling off of information. I like to say today, AI, language models, agents, economic models, these are all like professors. What do I mean by that? They can quote to you more information than you know about any particular subject with confidence, even when they're wrong. And they have absolutely zero common sense. So if you've ever sat in a conversation with a professor, they will with a sense of pride tell you about the most lunatic concept in the world, but think because they wrote it, it's really smart because they can back it up by other people who also did not exist in the real world. This is AI today.
Mhm.
So when you ask me about the skills, I think back to things that are core, Socratic teaching, something we don't do in this country anymore. And I remember growing up, history was taught very differently. Today, it's
Mhm.
about dates. When did something happen? Who
Yeah.
was there? And what was the next battle that took place, or what was it? When I grew up, it was a question of why did they make this decision? Right? You're sitting at the Battle of Midway. You have one carrier that's functioning, one that's being towed, and you're going up against a military that has just sank your fleet and has 7 carriers. Why in the world would you do this? And you start asking the students, would you do this? Why would you do this? What happens if you lose? Will the Pacific Coast be open? So why did they decide to do this? And you had to debate and think about what choices would you have made? Because sometimes the most probabilistic outcome is the wrong decision to make, and you
Mhm.
need to know that. So that's a skill set that needs to be taught because when you're looking for higher value, you need thinkers. As part of that, I think the reason why first principles and Aristotle's thinking is so critical is because you're always trying to get to the root cause of why something is happening. And autoregressive technology is always just going to go back to the most common, the average. So how do you get that alpha, that yield on top of it? Well, that's knowing when to actually break away. And I think today, the experience that people have with prompting is the example of where you're trying to have enough knowledge to get to the latent space inside of an LLM. That's where the real stuff is.
Hmm.
Because if I put an average prompt in, I'm not getting to an expert level answer. And this is why I think a lot of the early users of ChatGPT were like, it's okay. You ask a search level question, you get a search level response.
Right,
You
right,
ask an expert level question, and the LLM would go to a latent space that was so much better, where the results were so wow that you were like, this is great. And I think this is where humanity works with the machines at a new level. That's the skill we need.
right. But there seems that like opens up kind of an intangible here. And because a lot of I mean, it's not just, I mean, and I think I'm sure you'll agree, it's not just coming up with basically the right prompt with the right, with the right degree of forethought and consideration and nuance. But it's also knowing knowing also basically, and maybe this also goes back to the Socratic, the Socratic method, but learning how to question, and I'm not talking about questioning the model, but questioning what the model is giving you, because and this is where we get to the area, kind of, and it's a very blurry, it's a fine line between what's crazy and what's crazy, and this is true. And it also links to how we innovate. If we just look to the past, we're just going to basically do incremental improvements. So we need to do those great leaps. It takes basically a different type of mindset. So I want to turn this back in terms of on the human side of this. What's the right type of human type of mindset when you're working with the model that's basically dumb? It's basically Rain Man, and but it can but it can scale what you do, amazingly. What are the types of, let's say, like mental qualities you need to have in order to be able to scale, but yet also question it?
Yeah, look again. I would think from being a system thinker in AI is a bigger deal than people understand.
Yeah.
And for your audience, I want to try to take a step back just for a
Hmm.
second. I think most people who are reading anything in the last 3 years on AI presume that the language model providers are AI. They've tried to make it synonymous through the use of
Right.
AGI as if it's everything. That is not the case. Language models are extremely limited. In fact, you could argue today that language models are so limited that almost the entire revenue has been coding based.
Hmm.
Interesting.
Hmm.
There's very little on legal. It's there, but still relatively small. The rest is kind of all of us using it instead of like search, which is a big value, but relatively limited. And frankly, it's not accurate more often than we think. So coding has really become what these tools are. But the
Right.
revenue scale and the talking of it being AGI and something has gotten people thinking about it. The reality is everyone's going to be building their own brains. What do I mean by that? Okay, I can put a language model on top of an economic model. We do that. We have something called Tally where you can ask questions of the economic model. But I need to know what kind of economic model I'm trying to use for a certain problem. I assume that will get tied to logistics models, which are very different than language models.
Hmm.
Because if I'm trying to figure out the optimal way to pack up a truck and deliver my products so I can save money, that's a completely different logistics model that figures out how to deliver, where to deliver, what to do. And that will get put to a robotics model, which will load the packages, which will make sure it gets shipped, and may even go to a financial model to get insurance for that packages so it doesn't get destroyed on the way and have to be worried about. In other words, you're going to be stringing together brains, which is what we have in our brain. It's not one brain, right? We have different cortexes that put it together. So someone's got to be a system thinker and figuring out where are the edges of each of these models where they're no longer good enough that I have to bring something else in, and how do I string it together? So that to me is the big thing that I think is just underestimated because most people have been using a language model that's already been integrated with a voice model that's been integrated with a language, image, audio, video that's been integrated because that's the common or the commodity data providers. They've done that, but it stops there.
Okay, last question in this conversation, and I was kind of thinking about this earlier too. And that is when ChatGPT dropped in November 2022 or whatever it was, it sucked up all the oxygen. And suddenly that became synonymous with AI. That and diffusion models like generating cool images or whatever. That's what people thought of as AI. And people had been working in machine learning and data engineering for decades. We're like, hold on, hold on. We have these things like graph neural networks, and we have all kinds of non-transformer models that are very valuable. What would you say to people who are just coming to AI now? What do they need to know about models that are not LLMs and not diffusion and not the cool new stuff?
Yeah, the funny thing is I think because of the IPOs that are being talked about,
Right.
and I think when you think about all the main players that are involved, Jan LeCun, Fei Li, all
Yeah.
the people that started off in the language models,
Yeah.
and you might look in here because of all the press and think that's it. That's the least exciting part of the market.
Mm,
Almost everybody who's in the industry is like, look, that's a good financial exit, but I don't know if it's a long-term hold or if it's a trade, because the reason they gained scale early on was they were able to use commodity data. In other words,
Mm.
the entire internet became
mhm,
free to use.
Yeah.
Most of the real models where things are going to get truly done, where real decisions are going to get made, that's not commodity data. And in fact, that example I gave about how fast people were willing to switch from OpenAI to Claude, from Claude to Gemini, each of these benchmarks sort of become they're commodity players. At one point, these models always seem to revert to the same mean, and it becomes a price play. And I don't know if that's a good business to be in or a bad business to be in.
mm,
It could end up being Google, but I don't see an AdWords equivalent. I mean, Google was a search engine until AdWords,
mhm,
right? Because just like all the other search engines, like AltaVista was a great search engine, Lycos was a good search engine. All those guys were great until the SEO guys destroyed their rankings.
mhm,
What made Google win was AdWords produced so much more cash than all the other search engines did with advertising that they were able to hire search quality experts. If you remember back in the early days of Google, they had thousands of engineers. They all had one title, search quality. All they
Yeah.
did was constantly
mhm,
try to battle the SEO guys. And because they had so much cash, that's what made it work well.
mhm,
And that's what made these things take off. It wasn't the search was better. Everyone had better search for 3 weeks. I'm trying to figure out if someone comes up with a model that makes the LLMs worthy of the valuations they currently have, or do they start to go down the road of revenue sort of trailing off because in theory local models can start to do what they do. I've OpenClaw. I do a lot with my open models, that I don't have to go for tokens anymore. My token spend is already way down. And I wonder if this is sort of the trend we see,
mm,
in particular, because of coding. Those players do move pretty quickly from one provider to the next. We
mhm,
used to talk about Cursor a year ago as the company to be. We don't talk about it anymore, other than the fact that we think that Musk might save them from the inevitability of the
Yeah.
demise that Claude Code took over. This is how fast this stuff changes.
right, right, right. Yeah, talk about anything with I mean, these language models, the coding models, it's the new commodity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it may well be. Yeah, and you have too many players, right? I mean, I feel like we over-index on the late '90s, those of us who are around, but still, I think there are lessons here. At the time, every major telecom company built out a fiber optic network, and what happened? Well, they just drove each other into the ground because there was nothing premium about three different fiber optic networks that could do the same thing. And so we'll see how this round works out.
But of course,
Be interesting.
but until we finally got to utilizing all that fiber, but by that point, the industry dramatically consolidated.
Indeed, indeed.
Dramatically. Stephen, as always enjoy the conversations. Look forward to them. They're too rare, and we're hoping to have you back here again.
Anytime you want. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Tony. You guys are amazing. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with you guys.
Sounds
Oh,
good.
this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for taking the time while also running a very successful company.
Oh, and
Thank
by
you
the
for having
way,
me.
Take care, Stephen.
see you later.
Cheers.